Hi, everyone, and welcome to Empowered Advocacy's course, Understanding Executive Function Skills. This course really serves as a primer for our full-length in-person course, which is on practical differentiation strategies to use in the classroom for children that have executive function skill differences. If you would like to find out a little bit more about that course, on the last page of these slides, there'll be some contact details. We'd love for you to get in touch. Hi, I'm Tasha Jones. I am the Inclusion Specialist and Trainer at Empowered Advocacy. I am an occupational therapist, so I completed my BSc in OT in South Africa and then followed it up with an MSc in Neuroscience. I have 20 years experience as a pediatric occupational therapist, and I'm also the mom of a 14-year-old and a 10-year-old who keep me busy. I also have ADHD myself. So for me, executive function skill differences are not a theoretical concept. They are a lived experience. The executive function skill differences that I experience myself are both my greatest strengths in life and my biggest challenges. And I've seen both for myself and for the children that I've seen as a therapist what a difference it can make when you understand what the underlying executive function skill difference is and provide supports and strategies to be able to make a difference. It can really be world altering. So let's get on with it. Okay, so the word executive function is used fairly often, but what is it exactly? What we're going to do is we're going to look at a definition. I'm going to take you through that definition. We're going to talk a little bit about the different aspects of executive function skills. And then I'm going to use an analogy to help you understand each individual executive function skill and how it presents in children in the classroom. So, the definition of executive function is a set of cognitive skills that allow a person to organize their thoughts and actions in order to achieve a goal. So, let's break that definition up a little bit. If we're looking at cognitive skills, those are referring to the mental processes that the brain uses, thoughts and actions, fairly self explanatory. And the last point there, that it is to achieve a goal. So this is important. We're not using a lot of executive function skills when we're in a free flowing creative activity. Okay, so let's talk about where exactly executive function sits in the brain. So the brain is divided into different lobes. And although we now know that most brain functions rely on many different areas working together in the brain, it is still true that each lobe carries the bulk of certain functions. Now, executive function skills sit in the frontal lobe, and in particular in the prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of this frontal lobe that you can see highlighted here. Now, we know that executive function differences either come from structural differences in the brain or they come from neurochemical differences in the brain. So, if we look at the chemicals, there are sort of five main chemicals that are used in this part of the brain, and in fact, in every part of the brain. And we know that across pretty much every single neurodiversity we look at, there are differences in at least one of these neurochemicals. So either it is that the amount of the chemical produced is different, or the way that the brain breaks down that chemical is different. And we also know that there are structural differences. So the best example of this is in ADHD. When they did research, they looked at how quickly the cortex matures. So they're looking specifically at this prefrontal cortex, and they're looking at the thickness of that prefrontal cortex. So they're looking at these cell bodies that govern how the prefrontal cortex works, and they're looking at how fast they mature. And what they found in ADHD children is that these areas mature in exactly the same way as neurotypical children. The difference is that there's a delay. So by almost 30%, there's a delay in when they reach their peak maturation. And so this is really important for us to know, is that executive function differences are not a choice. They are not down to parenting. They are not down to a child's choice. They're not down to behavior. They're not down to whether or not a child just needs to try harder. These are specific chemical and structural differences in the brain. And when we can realize that, then we understand that we need to be those scaffold that can support those skills in their development as they are developing, perhaps a little bit delayed or a little bit differently to others. So let's run through some of the types of executive function skills. Now, there are many different models. Some of them say there are 13 executive function skills, some say there are 7, some break them down just into 3 broad categories. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through the 9 that I think are most important for school-age children. So executive function skills work in a loose hierarchy. There are foundation skills that are really important for a child to be able to have to develop some of those higher order skills. These skills include attention, emotional control, working memory, and impulse control. Now, I don't want you to concern yourself too much about the names. We're going to go through them and explain them in a lot more depth as we go along. So next up, we have task initiation, sustained attention, and time awareness. Now, there is time management, which is being able to use your time effectively. But frequently in neurodiverse children, time awareness in itself is problematic. So I like to call it time awareness because we're looking at more than just the usage of time. We're looking about the ability to feel the passing of time. Further up in our hierarchy, we have organization and planning, which are generally sort of lumped together because you kind of can't have one without the other. And then at the very top of our hierarchy, we have goal-directed persistence and metacognition. Now, these two at the bottom, alertness and processing speeds, are not actually part of executive function skills, but they are really important to understand as a baseline for all of those executive function skills because they really underpin everything else. Who experiences executive function skill differences? We know that these differences are a core feature of neurodiversities like ADHD and autism. There is really strong research to suggest that around 80% of children with ADHD have executive function skill differences. The research for autism isn't quite as clear, but it indicates somewhere around 60 to 70%. We also know that there tend to be specific skill differences in conditions like dyslexia, which sits at around 60 to 70% as well, dyspraxia, where the executive function skill differences are found in about 92% of children. So that's really high. And dyscalculia. Unfortunately, the research is pretty thin on dyscalculia, but we know that there are specific differences, particularly in working memory. Now, it's not just our neurodiverse kids that experience these things. We all know that there are certain states that we can be in that can make executive function skills more difficult, but these tend to be temporary states. For example, chronic sleep deprivation, extremely high stress situations, illness, and concussion. So let's run through some of the types of executive function skills. Now, there are many different models. Some of them say there are 13 executive function skills, some say there are 7, some break them down just into 3 broad categories. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through the 9 that I think are most important for school-age children. All right, so we're going to use the analogy of a car to help understand each of those executive function skills a little bit more specifically. We're going to talk about what the differences may look like, what those challenges may be, but also what the strengths are that are created from those challenges, because these executive function skills differences can be kind of frustrating in the classroom, but each of them has a specific set of strengths that come along with them as well. So I want to make a little point here because it doesn't matter if a child takes a drive to school in a 1970s Mini or in a luxury sports car or a suitable sedan. The child is going to be the same. However, the type of car that they're driving to school is going to change how the child can show up to their school day. So if we take this as an example, we've got a beautiful BMW 4 Series. On the left-hand side, we've got a closed coupe car. It's an automatic. It's air conditioning is incredible and it's a petrol engine, so it's really easy to fill up anytime you want. On the right-hand side, we have exactly the same car. Beautiful car, right? But this time it's a convertible. It's a manual gearbox, so it takes a little bit more, and it's a diesel engine. So every now and again, it's a little bit harder to find diesel and diesel fuel, and so sometimes it runs out of petrol and needs to be pushed, right? It's a manual car, so when you're sitting in traffic, it's a little bit more tiring, and it's a convertible, which most people would kill for at certain times in certain places. But say, for example, in Dubai summer, having a convertible, not a great option, right? So the child that drives to school in the car on the left, same car again, the child that drives into the car in school in the car on the left is going to arrive in school calm and collected and cool. The one who maybe had to push a little bit of the way to get to the petrol station because the first one didn't have diesel and has had to drive manual through the traffic and has been sitting in a convertible in the Dubai heat, they're going to drive to school not feeling quite so great. So this just kind of goes to show you that it really, executive function skills, if we think about executive function skills as that car, it's not going to change the child, but it is going to change how they can show up. All right, so let's start with alertness. Now, remember, this is not actually an executive function skill. It is more an underlying mental process that is important for all of those other executive function skills. So, alertness can be thought of as turning on the car, being able to start the engine. Alertness is defined as a general state of wakefulness where you're ready to respond to stimuli and able to perceive and attend to your surroundings. So, alertness can present in two separate ways. It can be difficult for a child to move into a state of alertness. This is particularly important for children with ADHD, where a lot of research has shown that they have delayed circadian rhythm. So, they have a sleep phase disorder, which means that their melatonin and all of their sleep hormones only released much later on into the evening. And so their natural sleep wake cycle is delayed and pushed back then into the morning. And so it's really hard for them to get up and get moving in the mornings. This can look like distractibility, it can look like a lack of caring as well. Now, the strength associated with this is that if you ever need someone in a crisis late at night, you definitely want it to be your ADHD friend. So, children can also be stuck in a state of hyper alertness and hyper awareness. I think a great example of this is pretty much everyone during the war when missiles were being intercepted. There were very loud sounds. We became very hypersensitive to a garbage truck or someone slamming a door. And that sort of hyper alertness can affect your ability to engage in a task. So it often is associated with a sensory sensitive presentation. It's highly linked to trauma as well. So that's something that's important to bear in mind. And these children often have a really high awareness of their environment and the people around them. Moving on to processing speed. So, processing speed, we can kind of think of as the engine of the car. So, processing speed, we can kind of think of it is defined as the pace at which your brain takes in, interprets, and then responds to information. It is unrelated to intelligence. And I think that's a really important point because a lot of the time we might have really slow processes and it can look like it might be a cognitive skills deficit, but it's not necessarily related at all. So, again, there are kind of two ways that this can present. You can have those that are slow in terms of their processing speed. For these children, it takes long for them to understand and complete tasks. They can get easily overwhelmed by information or sensory input, and they frequently experience anxiety and fatigue. So, if we kind of think of this child as having a smaller engine, again, the child is the same. It's just the engine in their car that's moving a little bit slower. It's going to take them a lot longer to get where they need to be. But on the plus side, these kids are often careful decision makers. They think in depth as well. Then you can get your fast processors. Frequently, this is associated with ADHD, but really the research doesn't actually back up that all kids with ADHD have faster processing speeds. There is a fairly large range. These children can get impatient quickly. They often make mistakes because they're going too quickly. They frequently start before the instructions are completed. And of course, this can make them really quick learners, but it can also have challenges in the classroom. Moving on to working memory. So this is the first of our true executive function skills. And working memory is something that is impacted almost across the board in our neurodiverse kids. So it's a really important concept to understand. So hopping back to our car analogy, working memory is your ability to be checking in your rearview mirror, to remember what you've come from. And more than that, it's about that constant checking in. So even though we might not necessarily be very aware of it, we have a constant kind of picture of what's happening behind us because our eyes are always paying just a little bit of attention to the rearview mirror. Or we might flick our eyes up every now and again to just kind of check in and see what's going on. So working memory is very much like that. It's that ability to remember what has been said, done in a short distance back from where we are right now. But it's also the ability to constantly check in on that information, to remember and hold that information in mind. Working memory is defined as the ability to temporarily hold and manipulate information in your mind whilst processing new information. So this is not the ability to remember something and give it back to you rote. Often that is using other memory skills. The real important part about working memory is that it needs to be held onto while processing new information. So, for example, you have a child in class, you've given them the instruction. Please go and get your glue and your book and a pair of scissors so that you can cut out the work that I've given you and come back and begin your task. So that's a multi-step instruction. That child needs to now hold those things in mind. And if you say to them straight after you've given the instruction, what are the things you need to do? They might be able to repeat it back to you. But then they head off to go get their glue, and Sarah took the glue stick that they specifically wanted to have, and so they're getting a little upset about that. So now they have to go get the glue from around the corner. And while they're around the corner, Johnny tells them a funny story and wants to show them the toy that they have, and then they see someone else's needle. And before you know it, they've come and sat down at their desk. They've got the glue stick, but they've got nothing else. So it's that ability to hold the information in mind whilst new information is being inputted into us. So this can look like misplacing items. It can look like struggling to follow instructions, particularly multi-step instructions. It can look like forgetting what was being said or what they were going to say. I'm going to be honest, this was something that I really struggled with as a child. I would often know the answer. I'd put my hand up, and then the teacher would call me, and the stress of the situation and stress of people looking at me would make me freak out completely. I had no idea what it was that I was going to say, and I'd have to sheepishly admit to that. So it can also look like forgetting to remember, and that's a really big one. So this affects the ability to do homework, to remember dates, to remember important items, to remember promises. And this is often something that gets kids with working memory difficulties into a fair amount of trouble, because it's not that they can't remember. If you then sit that child down and go, right, now think back to what I said to you, what was it that you needed to get? They're probably going to be able to remember the list of items that they needed to get. But their working memory has let them down. So in the moment when the information was being processed, their working memory has failed them. And so they've forgotten to remember, as opposed to straight out forgetting. It can also look like leaving to get one thing, coming back with three completely different things, coming back with nothing. And these kids can frequently get pretty good at lying, particularly if forgetting and those kind of working memory lapses are punished or seen as a negative thing. They frequently come up with very creative answers as to why it was they were not able to do that particular task. These kids are highly adaptable, because they have arrived at school without their iPad or without their PE kit on so many occasions that they have a list of excuses, of things that they can do. When they get into a situation where they're unprepared, they are frequently able to think on their feet because they have had a great amount of practice at it. Task initiation. This is another really big one in class for a lot of our neurodivergent children. So we are thinking about task initiation, as the saying goes, as being able to get into gear, about being able to get from that neutral state into first gear and start moving on a task. Task initiation has a really simple definition. It is the ability to start a task without unnecessary delay. So this can look like getting stuck in freeze mode. They're just sitting there staring off into the distance, not starting their task. It can look like procrastination, and frequently these kids have many different ways that they can procrastinate, either with distracting their friends, distracting themselves, getting tied up in a different activity. It can also look like avoidance. It can create oppositional behavior as well, and refusal sometimes as well. So it's really important for us to understand that the reasons behind task initiation difficulties can be really complex and really multifactorial. And it's important for us to understand what those differences are so that we can be able to address each one specifically and move on. So the strengths that are associated with people that have task initiation difficulties, it's often because because they have such high expectations, and or because they have maybe lots of ideas. So they've got all these ideas running around in their head and they just can't choose one, or their imagination is taking them away with each one and what the possibilities could be. And so these are skills that we can develop. These are really important skills for school that we can develop, having these high expectations, having a sense of perfectionism that's stopping them from starting, or having all of these ideas. We just need to understand what it is that's creating the task initiation difficulty so that we can help them to move forward. Impulse control. Probably one of the biggest social challenges at school for children with ADHD, often referred to as inhibition or impulsivity as well. So, in our analogy, impulse control is like being able to apply the brakes. I'm not sure where I need to turn, so I'm going to brake so that I can give myself enough time to think about what I need to do next. It's that ability to stop and pause in a situation. The definition of impulse control is the ability to pause, giving the opportunity to reflect on choices in order to avoid acting on our immediate desires or urges. So this is pretty self-explanatory. I think most of us know what impulse control difficulties look like in class. These kids can get themselves into dangerous situations. They are quick to react. They often act before thinking it through. They might speak out of turn. They can have big emotional reactions to seemingly small events. They can act in physical ways before they've had a chance to process whether or not they should be doing that. Um, on the plus side, these kids, man, they are brave, they are resilient, and they are frequently very spontaneous and fun to be around. Emotional control is such a big topic, and there are so many different ways of thinking about it. For today's example, we're going to think about emotional control as the shock absorbers in your car. So when we come across a bump in the road, if we don't have great shock absorbers, we're going to really feel that bump. It's going to be uncomfortable. If you're driving in a luxury car and you've got excellent shock absorbers, you might go over that bump. You might not even notice that it happens. So the definition of emotional control is the ability to manage and influence one's emotional state. It includes regulating both how emotions are felt and how they're expressed. Now, this is not just a verbal expression. It can be through body language. It can be through withdrawal. It can be verbal as well. And it can look like there's sort of two different patterns again. You can have these big emotional responses. You can have big reactions to seemingly small events, sharp mood changes, difficulty with calming down, especially once they've gotten upset. These are the kids that are extremely expressive. even though they might not be able to tell you a lot of details, but they'll let you know if they're not okay. But you can also have the opposite in that. You can have children that withdraw, that shut down, that freeze in those situations. And the more emotionally overwhelmed they become, the more withdrawn they can become. And it can be difficult to know what's happening with those children because they're not very expressive with it. Children with emotional control difficulties are often the most empathetic, passionate, and creative ones out there. I love not addressing attention to start off with. And here's why. A lot of people think about executive function skills and they immediately jump to attention. And when they think about attention, they think about it as, can they pay attention or can they not pay attention? And really, attention is such a complex process that happens in the brain. And frequently, for our children with neurodivergence, it is not an attention problem, it is an ability to regulate that attention. So, to understand attention, we're going to think of attention kind of like the headlights on the car that we're driving. Attention can come in three kind of states. We can have a focused attention. If we think about the way you'd want to drive down a dark road, your headlights will be on. You'll be able to see most of the road, not too much of your environment around you, enough to keep yourself safe. So sometimes attention can be more like a very small pinpoint spotlight. You can't see anything else that's going on around you at the time. All you can see is that very small part that's lit up. This is the kind of attention that's used in hyperfocus, or if there's a really, really important task in front of us. We can also have a very diffuse attention. In a diffuse attention, we have the road illuminated in front of us, but we have almost all of the environment illuminated as well. When we do that, we can see there's a deer on the side of the road, there's an owl over there. In the classroom, children that tend to have a more diffuse attention state can pick up when someone's moving over there and when that noise is happening over there. And they're often distracted by these things. Now, it's not to say that one state of attention is better than the other. It's about where you want to use that attention and how you want to use that attention. In class, we would hope to have that sort of general focused version of attention. But if you're out on a game drive and you're looking for things around in your environment, you want to have that diffuse attention. Now, the trick comes in when you have a diffuse attention and you need to have a more focused attention, you have a pinpoint attention, and you need to have a more focused attention. And that's where the problem comes in for a lot of our neurodivergent kids. A lot of that is around being able to regulate what state of attention they're able to be in the classroom. So, attention is defined as the ability to select and focus processing of relevant environmental or internal information while ignoring distractions. So just important to note there that it's both environmental, so things that you can see and hear that are around in your environment, but also internal information. So that can be interoception. So are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Is your bladder full? But also the internal world of your mind as well. So do you have racing thoughts? Is there a song playing in your brain, which is often the case for kids with ADHD? So just to understand that it's both the environmental factors and the internal factors that play a role in your attention. So, like I said earlier, it's often not attention that is the problem. And I think this is something that can be really frustrating sometimes for teachers because they'll see a child with their favorite thing to learn about, and man, their attention is incredible. But you ask them to focus on a maths problem or something else, and they say that they're unable, they look as though they're unable to do it. And it can be really frustrating to understand that it's not about the skill of attention. It's not about whether or not this child can pay attention. It's about their regulation of that attention state. So when a child, say, for example, with ADHD, is really deeply involved in something that gives them a lot of motivation, they can often hyper-focus on that. They can have that really pinpoint attention. But if there's something that doesn't grab their motivation, it doesn't sort of cross that threshold of interest and motivation for them, then their attention is often much more diffuse and they really struggle to move into a focused form of attention. And it can be difficult to sort of understand when you're seeing one version of attention and then it can look like it's an intentional lack of sort of wanting to do a task and perhaps being a little bit defiant. But really, it's about this regulation of attention that can be really, really difficult. So again, this can kind of come in two states. You can have a child who is easily distracted. They can struggle to finish a task. They might be disruptive. They might interrupt frequently. So that's sort of these sort of outward, big, distractible kind of behaviors. But you might also have a child who tends to be very hyper-focused, who might find it very difficult to swap between tasks. They might be deeply interested in something and really struggle to move away from it. And moving away from it can cause dysregulation as well. So again, you have this kind of mixed profile, and the strengths are the same. Some children have certain strengths, some children have others, but in general, these kids can be highly aware. They can be really creative in their thought because those thoughts are dancing around and doing all sorts of things and jumping from one topic to the next. They can really come up with amazing ideas. They often have very deep passions. They have a beautiful and very strong imagination. They're really good with lateral thinking, again, because their thoughts tend to be much more diffuse. They can jump from one topic to the next and come up with really interesting ways to solve problems. So we've done attention, and now we're going to look at sustained attention. So if attention is being able to direct the headlights, sustained attention is being able to keep those headlights directed in the way that you need them for the duration of a task or your day. When we're thinking of sustained attention, it is kind of like being able to keep your steering wheel in the right position so that you can move your car along the road in the way that you want to and the way that's safe. So it's that constant kind of making small adjustments to your attention to be able to stay in the lane that you want to be in. It's defined as the ability to maintain focused concentration on a task, stimulus, or activity for an extended period, often while ignoring distractions and in the presence of fatigue. So it obviously makes sense that a child that struggles to regulate their attention into the state of attention that they want is going to struggle to keep that attention in that state as well. This can look like difficulties with finishing a task. It can look like fatigue or a child that's sort of tapping out halfway through. Distractibility, obviously, and conversation drift. So often, you'll have a child put their hand up in your class and they start off with something that seems really relevant and then they bounce onto something else and they bounce off something else. And by the end of it, you're not really sure what they were talking about because they've kind of moved off of the road that they were driving on. So the strengths associated with this is, again, they tend to be really adaptable because the sustained focus is difficult. They have lots of different methods and strategies and things that they try and use to bring themselves back, or they have lots of really charming ways to try and get out of a thing that they're no longer able to focus and pay attention to. And again, for that same reason of having these sort of quite diffuse ways of paying attention, they tend to be really creative problem solvers too. Next up, we have cognitive flexibility. So cognitive flexibility is the ability to change your mind. So in our little analogy, it's the ability to get yourself into reverse gear. It's the ability to do a U-turn on the road that you're driving on when you realize that you've taken a wrong turn. It's defined as the ability to change your thinking or actions when something new happens, something changes, or plans don't work out. So this looks like kids that get really stuck thinking. When they've decided something, it's really hard to change their minds. We often sort of think of this as that sort of stuck thinking. That's the opposite to a growth mindset. They have difficulty managing changes in plans. They have difficulties with transitions. It might look like a lot of emotional dysregulation. And sometimes they can have the difficulty taking the perspective of others. So, for example, if little Johnny bumps into Matthew and Matthew gets really upset and he's like, "You did that on purpose." And it's just really hard for him to change his mind, even though little Johnny has said that, well, actually, someone else bumped into him and he tripped over a chair and it was an accident. But sometimes that sort of that inability to look at things from other people's perspectives can be that sort of stuck thinking, that lack of cognitive flexibility. And when we think about it from that perspective, it's much easier for us to deal with it rather than we think of a child who has emotional control difficulties. So often these kids can be really consistent and really reliable, and they often thrive with routine and predictability. Okay, so next up is time awareness. And this is one of the subjects that I love to talk about the most because I think when people understand the level of difficulty that is experienced here with neurodivergent kids, it can really open up an understanding of what's going on and what we can do to help these kids. And I know what you were thinking. You were thinking this was going to be a clock, but no. So, time awareness is more than just knowing the time and knowing how much longer you've got in a task. It's about being able to understand and feel the passing of time. It's about being able to parcel time out into useful sort of units. It's about being able to understand the time of now versus in a little while versus later on today versus tonight versus tomorrow versus years and years and years in advance. So it's more than just that sort of understanding of time and use of your time. It's about really being able to gauge time. It's about your internal clock. So, like I said, it's defined as the ability to perceive, understand, organize, and effectively use time to meet a goal. Now, it's normally just the last part that we think of when we think about time awareness or time management, but really it's about that perceiving, understanding, and organizing as well. So this can look like a difficulty with feeling the passing of time. And this it can really impact a child because when they look at a task, especially if it's a task with multiple steps, or if it's a task that looks like it might take a while, genuinely to a child that has time awareness difficulties, it can feel like that is going to take forever. So when they say, "Oh, ma'am, this is going to take forever," they mean it. They're not, they're not speaking in hyperbole. They actually mean that it feels like it's going to take them forever. And similarly, they might start a task where you're like, "Why are you doing that now? You know that you're going to need to pack up in 5 minutes." And they're like, "Yes, but I can definitely get it finished." But again, it's that not being able to sort of organize time and feel the passing of time and to pass out how much time an activity is going to take. So they also struggle to speed up or slow down based on the time available. They have difficulty estimating the time required for a task. And frequently they get lost in thought. And because there's this really rich internal world that's kind of distracting them and that they can move into. And when they can't feel the passing of time, they can't actually sort of catch themselves doing that. They can't actually catch that distractibility that's affecting their ability to engage. And so it's something that can sort of create this kind of disconnect in what they want to be doing and what they actually end up doing. So this lack of time awareness is also probably the reason why a lot of these kids can move into a hyper-focus mode sometimes, because they're not tracking the passing of time, because they're so deeply engaged. And that lack of sort of time awareness allows them to remain deeply engaged in that task. And they can be really good at operating in the present, right? So I don't worry about what's coming later. I don't worry about the fact that I've got homework to do, but actually I'm going to play a game now. So, and that can be a really great thing as well. So we've got to kind of focus on that too. All right, if you're still with me, thank you very much. We have 3 left. We're going to move on to organization and planning. So perhaps to be expected, this is kind of like your GPS system. So it's about understanding that I need to be at my friend's house at 12:30 and it's going to take me half an hour. So I need to leave at 12, but I also need to stop and get some petrol. So I need to leave at 10 to. And when I get there, it's her birthday. So I need to have a present with me, which means that yesterday I needed to have gone to the shops to buy something. So it's about really being able to sort of map that task, map how long it's going to take you. So time awareness plays quite a big role here as well, and being able to understand what tools you need, what actions you need to take, and in what sequence you need to take them. So it's defined as the ability to set goals, outline plans to achieve them, and use strategies to maintain these steps. It's pretty self-explanatory, this one. So it looks like disorganized work, losing belongings frequently. It can also look like getting lost inside the school, even though they may have been going there for a while and they should know exactly where they're going. It can look like difficulty sequencing tasks, but not just sequencing tasks, also sequencing and organizing their thoughts and their stories. And so these kids might have a really great idea. They kind of know how the story wants to end, but they're not able to organize their thoughts in a way that allows you to really follow the story, and sort of allows you to understand or allows them to sort of show that great imagination. And often these kids get stuck in analysis paralysis. So they know that maybe organization and planning isn't something that's really strong for them. And so they spend a lot of time thinking about what they should be doing, thinking about how they should be doing it in order to not make a mistake. But they can kind of get stuck in this thinking mode as opposed to actually performing the action. Again, it makes them really creative problem solvers, because when they've forgotten something, lost something for the 15th time, they have all these amazing ways to fix that problem. And again, they tend to be very adaptable people, because those plans are not necessarily being generated and they're kind of doing the fly by the seat of their pants. Okay, so goal-directed persistence, in our analogy, is the fuel system and the fuel gauge in the car. It's defined as the ability to sustain effort towards goals despite obstacles or setbacks. So this can look like having meltdowns at home. Often these kids might have meltdowns at home when they seem like they've been okay throughout the day. It can look like fatigue, particularly towards the end of the day. It can look like a lack of motivation, or that they're giving up easily, not finishing tasks, that they've got good ideas, but they might have very little follow through. Now, part of this, depending on sort of the neurodiversity that we're looking at, part of this can be a motivation issue. Part of it can be a novelty seeking issue. So in the beginning of the task, the novelty level is high, but by sort of halfway through, the information is no longer new, it's no longer satiating their curiosity, and so they can lose interest or motivation. But I think it's also really important to understand that this sort of our brain's ability to do hard things and to keep moving towards a goal, it's a finite resource. There's one particular part of the brain called the anterior inferior cingulate gyrus. Not that that's important, but it's a cool name. And that is a sort of really small area in the brain, and it holds most of our ability to do this. And I want you to imagine, if you do have this car, this convertible in the Dubai summer heat, that's, difficult to find petrol for. So you're having to go off, off your planned path to be able to get petrol. It's a manual and you're stuck in traffic. So by the end of it, you're tired. You're going to be using up a lot more of your energy than that person driving automatic cruise control car with, that's a closed coupe. And so it's really important for us to acknowledge that. And in addition to that, we also know that a lot of the neurodiversity conditions tend to have differences in their mitochondrial functioning. So mitochondria are these little things that exist in all cells. They are our energy production factories inside the cell, and they make a specific molecule called ATP. And ATP is our cell's fuel. Now, we know with a lot of neurodivergent kids, that system might be not working quite as efficiently. The mitochondria might not be producing as many ATP. There might be different numbers in mitochondria. And so it's really important to understand that this fuel for them is a more limited resource than for other children. They might not be able to engage with quite as much. They might not be able to sustain that engagement for quite as long. they might need more breaks, more downtime than other children. So it's really important to understand this as a concept, and to understand how we can support students that might have differences in the way that this area functions. Again, these children can be really good at prioritizing based on importance. So they understand that their energy level might not sort of quite fit their demands for the day, and they're good at being able to prioritize what things are going to get their attention and which ones are not. And they tend to be really curious as well. Okay, we've done it. We've got to the last executive function skill, and that is metacognition. So this is really our ability to kind of zoom outside of ourselves, to get a big picture of what we're doing, how we're functioning, and sort of often described as thinking about thinking. So as I said, the definition of metacognition is the ability to monitor and control one's thought processes. It is thinking about doing, thinking about being, thinking about learning. And there are two sort of components to it. So there's metacognitive knowledge and there's metacognitive regulation. So metacognitive knowledge is a child's ability to understand their strengths and weaknesses, what works for them, as well as their impact on the world. Metacognitive regulation is a child's ability to then use that information in real time to plan an approach, to monitor what's working, or to change their actions. This can look like not having a good understanding of their impact on others. It can look like difficulty understanding where their errors are. It can look like knowing, but not being able to make changes. And that's why it's just so important for us to teach the how. How do they do it? Not just what do they need to do. Frequently, these kids might think they've done better than they actually have because that sort of judgment and internal reflection is not quite as strong as they need to be. So some of the strengths associated with this, and I think this is probably one of the most beautiful things, is that they often come up with ideas before they self-monitor and shut down what it was that they were thinking about. They often have really original thought, and I think it's such an important thing in our world to kind of nurture this while still developing some of the self-monitoring that they need to be able to be successful. They're often really resilient after failures because they're not necessarily able to monitor their behavior or the way that they're impacting on others. They often make mistakes or they make mistakes in tasks. And so they often become really resilient after failure. They're really good at getting back from making a mistake. Okay, you've done it, you've stuck with it. We've made it through all of the executive function skills. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a quick example so we can kind of put it all into practice. And then we're going to talk about where you fit in. Okay, so we're going to look at something that each of you probably say tons of times in a day, and that is you give a child an instruction. I'm going to hand out your worksheets. Please cut them out so they fit into your book, stick them in neatly, and don't forget to write the date. Okay, so I want you to just pause the video here and think about how many executive function skills can you identify that a child would be using in this sort of really simple kind of everyday task. Okay, so hopefully you've taken a minute and tried to think about how you can break that task down and understand it in terms of what executive function skills are being used. So let's go through a couple of them. So we have attention, that is being able to listen to your instructions, being able to stay on task throughout. We've got inhibition, so that's not getting distracted along the way. It's not getting distracted by their friends or by a conversation or by a toy or by noises from outside. It's about task initiation, so being able to actually get started in the task. Organization and planning. What do I need to get? I need to cut first and then glue. I need to account for the margins on the worksheet. I need to account for the margins on the page. Working memory. Don't forget to cut it out first. Don't forget to put the date on. Make sure that you fill in everything. time awareness. So can I complete this task in time? How long do I have to do the cutting out and sticking in task? And how long do I have to actually complete the worksheet? Goal-directed persistence. So being able to actually finish and get to the end. And metacognition. Am I completing the work properly? So there's lots of different things, and depending on the situation that you put this child in, possibly also it's emotional regulation, so dealing with your table mates, sharing resources. It's also cognitive flexibility. Oh, I made a mistake while I was cutting out. What am I going to do now? I made a mistake on my worksheet. Do I erase it? Am I going to get really upset about the fact that now I've made this mistake and I have to cross it out and want a whole new worksheet? So in even the most simple tasks, there are so many of these different executive function skills, and they all interplay with each other to really affect the way that a child is able to engage with the task. And if you think about all of those different executive function skills, I think it should really make you excited, because when you think about that simple task, each one of those executive function skills is a point in which you can access and help that child out, if that's one that they might be struggling with. So I think it's really exciting. We can sort of break these tasks down to understand where those executive function components lie, and especially when we know a little bit about the executive function of our children. Say we've got a child that has working memory difficulties. Well, we can look at that task and go, okay, I know she's going to struggle with this particular part, so I'm going to actually put those instructions on the board in writing so that she can continue to monitor it. So when we know the executive function skills of a task and we understand the executive function skills of our children, we can really be the difference in how they actually finish that task or engage with that task. Okay, so that brings us to you. Where do you fit in the whole scheme of this? Well, you are the road. You are the town planning. You are the things that allow these kids with their beautiful, different, amazing cars of executive function that they're driving around in. You are the thing that guides them to where they want to go. And if you can understand that sort of car of executive function that they're driving, you can change the road for them. Do they have a F1 Ferrari that goes at 100 miles an hour but doesn't handle turns well? Well, you want to try and make that road nice and flat and straight and long. Do you have a child that has inhibition problems? Well, okay, their brakes might not be so great, so they're going to need a few extra stops along the way to help them check in. Do you have somebody that needs a few extra barriers? Do you have someone that needs a really interesting road system where they can get lost along lots of different pathways to satiate that beautiful curiosity? Do you need to create a road that's got lots of bumps and excitement and adventure along it? Or do you need something that's going to be really linear and expected in a grid-like form? So the way that you interact with these children when you understand their executive function skills is really, it plays such a massive role in how they experience it themselves and how they experience their school life. Okay, so maybe this is the frustrating part, because we've come to the end of the presentation and hopefully you're thinking to yourself, okay, great. So I have this good analogy that's going to allow me to remember all the different components of executive function skills, and I'm going to be able to understand these children a little bit better in terms of the areas that they might be struggling with. But you might also be thinking to yourself, okay, the analogy is great for these roads, but how do I do that? Now, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, that is available. We have a course on differentiation strategies for executive function skills. And I know what you might be thinking, oh, I've heard them all, I know them all. I know how to set timers and make checklists and to-do lists and have visuals. But we really look at each of those individual executive function skills, and we go through a range of different options. And it's not just the basic ones that you may have heard before. We really go into depth about how we can support these skills with novel ways and ways that do not take a massive amount of your time and energy. Things that can be used as whole class strategies for certain of the executive function skills. Things that are easy and low cost to implement. So if that sounds interesting, then please get in touch. You can get hold of me by scanning the QR code or any of the details below. Please feel free to ask any questions you might have about this course or any questions you might have on the course for differentiation strategies for executive function in the classroom. We also offer a range of other trainings for schools, both for teachers, LSAs, and also for parents. We have trainings on sensory processing and sensory friendly classrooms, on fine motor skills, play, you name it. So we also do custom made courses for your school as well, if there's a particular area that you would like us to address. So thank you again for sticking out. I hope that you've learned something, and please feel free to get in touch anytime.